want to start today with a really unique story. Back in the day, a guy and a girl from two different towns, they got married. And at their wedding reception, the groom told a riddle to some guys from the bride's town. And he made a bet with them that they couldn't solve it. So the guys, they went to the bride and they asked for a favor saying, hey, can you please find out the answer to your husband's riddle and tell it to us? Because if you don't, we're gonna kill you and your parents. Cool? Thanks. So the bride begged her husband for the answer, and finally he caved and told her. She then passed the answer on to her hometown friends. They solved the riddle and won the bet. Well, the groom was eventually unhappy about this, so much so that he lost his temper, killed a bunch of people in their town, and then left town. Maybe a slight overreaction. The bride's dad was like, wow, that was the worst wedding reception ever. And he assumed the groom was gone for good. So he gave his daughter to be married to someone else. But after some time passed, the groom actually comes back and he asked the father-in-law, hey, where's my wife? And the dad said, I thought you were gone, so I gave her to be married to someone else. Why don't you marry her younger sister? And the groom was like, no. And once again, the groom flips out. He did what any normal scorned lover would do. He gathered a bunch of foxes, tied their tails together, lit their tails on fire, and set them loose. And the foxes run around like their tails were on fire because they actually were on fire. And in the process, they started a wildfire that burns down a bunch of the grain, all the vineyards and olive groves in town. Now that's a really crazy story. And it's in the Bible. As a kid, I'd hear this story and wonder, what in the world could this possibly have to do with my life? Is the Bible teaching me to never tell riddles at wedding receptions? Is it teaching me not to set animals on fire? What is this even about? And more than once, I read things in the Bible that would make me ask, can someone please explain this to me? Fast forward to today, and there's still a lot about the Bible that's confusing to me. Jesus doesn't appear in the story about the foxtails, and he doesn't appear in the list of ancient commands and rituals that people in that time were supposed to obey. Sure, Jesus helps us see God more clearly, and he helps us see the whole story of God and the whole world more clearly. But what are we supposed to do with the rest of the Bible? The parts that make us scratch our heads? For example, there are more than a few verses that seem really weird. Imagine reading your daily devotional and seeing this passage. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. What are we supposed to do with that verse? Also, there are many more Bible stories that seem really, really crazy. If you look through the Old Testament, you'll read about talking animals, detailed acts of crazy violence, and people who brought down fire from the sky. These stories don't seem relatable to our lives at all. And then there are commands that don't make any sense. There's one command in Leviticus for people not to wear clothes that are made out of two different kinds of material. So if you're wearing something that's made of cotton and polyester blend, you're in trouble, right? Wait, that doesn't seem right at all. The point is, sometimes it feels like there's a disconnect between what we're told about the Bible and what we actually read in the Bible. We're told that, the Bible can change us, it can help you, it can guide all of us, that it can impact every area of our lives. But when we take the time to read it for ourselves, it can actually be pretty confusing. And how can something confusing actually change us or help us or guide us? So is there something we're missing? Is there a different way to do all of this? Let's start again with what makes the Bible the Bible. As we mentioned last week, it's comprised of many different kinds of writings. In fact, the Bible is a collection of 66 different documents that have been bound together. There are poetry books. There are books containing laws for the ancient Jewish people. There are history books. There's what's called wisdom books, filled with lots of great advice and insights. There are letters, lots of letters, written by and for different people in different parts of the world. And all 66 of these books are wrapped up into one big book, the Bible. I know it's been a minute since most of us have been in school, but if you've ever taken a standardized test where your reading comprehension was being graded, you know that one of the first things you should do when reading something is to understand the context in which it was written. We can apply that same approach when we read the Bible. When we try to read any of these 66 individual different documents, whenever we read a book in the Bible, we need to keep the book's context in mind. And the reason why this is so important is this: context creates clarity. Let me repeat. Context creates clarity. Sometimes it's helpful to think of it this way. I'm not reading the Bible. I'm reading a document found in the Bible. Instead of reading a book, I'm reading a letter written to a specific group of people living in the first century. Or I'm reading some wise advice a father wrote down for his son. Or I'm reading a history book recording everything that happened in a battle, all from the winner's perspective. Or I'm reading a song written to God by someone who knew him well. Or I'm reading a story about Jesus from someone who was actually there, or who knew someone who was actually there. In all of these different Bible passages, context matters. It changes how we read everything. So let's actually try something together today. Let's look at two different passages and see how understanding the context can explain what's going on. The first passage is from 2 Timothy. Now, this is what we know about the details surrounding this book. This is a letter written to a guy named Timothy, and it's written by the Apostle Paul. Paul is Timothy's mentor. And it's called 2 Timothy, which means that there was a letter written before this, 1 Timothy. And beyond these two letters, chances are Paul and Timothy have been writing a bunch of other letters that are probably not included in the Bible. And we also know Timothy was the leader of a church in Ephesus, a church full of people who were struggling to understand how to do church in the first century. So with all of that in mind, listen to what Paul writes. Only Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, be sure to bring the coat I left with Carpus at Troas. Also bring my books and especially my papers. Context makes this seemingly random verse make a little more sense. Understanding that Paul and Timothy have a great relationship and they've been writing each other for years helps us understand why these seemingly insignificant details are in this letter. Now here's a second example. If you've been around church for a while, you've potentially read or heard this verse. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Now, with no context, this verse could seem like we just stumbled across a magic genie in the Bible. I can dunk a 10-foot basketball goal through Christ who gives me strength. I can speak Russian without studying through Christ who gives me strength. I can cross off everything on my to-do list today through Christ who gives me strength. With no context at all, this sounds like a formula for living the life of our dreams, doesn't it? But does it mean what we think it means? Let's look at the context. This is also found in a letter written by the Apostle Paul, but this audience was an entire group of people. Paul was writing to the whole church in Philippi while he was in prison after being arrested for his faith. And in this part of the letter, Paul was thanking them for sending him some money, some financial support, and acknowledging their kindness. And at the same time, he assured them that they didn't need to feel obligated to send more money. So Paul let them know he would be okay whether he had a little or a lot. So this section is really about contentment. Paul was letting his friends know that he had figured out how to be peaceful and content with his life, whether he was sitting on a beach or sitting in a prison cell. How could Paul find contentment even as he wrote from prison with very few things going his way? For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Paul was dependent on Jesus. His close relationship with Jesus gave him the power and strength to persevere and find peace, even when things were tough. So here, the point isn't so much having Jesus is like having a winning lottery ticket for life. It's because of Jesus, we can be okay, whether life is going our way or not, whether we have a little or a lot. We can turn our attention away from our circumstances and onto Jesus. And in turn, we can find peace and strength through him. Do you see how the verse changes as we discover context? It helps us to better understand what we're reading, and it helps us to know what we're supposed to do with it because, again, context creates clarity. Can you imagine walking into a movie theater halfway through the movie If you have no idea who the characters are, if you have no idea what has transpired already, if you have no clue as to whether you were sitting down for an action movie or a romantic comedy, well, in that moment, nothing would make sense. But we can often read the Bible in the same way. We may randomly pick verses or passages, but have no idea why or to whom they were written. We may assume we should do exactly what they say in our own lives, even if that wasn't the point. No wonder it can be so confusing sometimes. Without the biblical context, we're just guessing at what we're supposed to learn from it. And don't miss this. If what we said last week is true, if the point of the Bible is to actually know God better, it's too important to just guess at what's going on. If we miss the backstory, if we miss the big picture, we run the risk of missing out on understanding the God behind it all. So instead of being overwhelmed by what we don't understand, let's look for what we can learn by asking some simple contextual questions. The next time you come across a verse you don't understand, try asking these questions. Who wrote it, and who was this written to? Sometimes a passage doesn't make sense to us because we don't understand who the audience is. So start there. A good way to gain context on the Bible is through a study Bible or a commentary, which can provide the details around Scripture. Another question you want to ask, why was it written down? 2 Timothy was written to encourage a friend in his leadership as a Christian. Philippians was written to remind a group of people that they were loved by God and to encourage them to keep following Jesus. Each part of the Bible was written for a reason. Here's another question. What made people think this information should be written down or saved? Over the thousands of years since some of these texts were written down, decisions were made about what text will be included in the Bible and which shouldn't. What is it about what you're reading that made people think it was important enough to protect? And again, here's another question. Is it helpful to me or not? The whole Bible is important, but not all parts are equally helpful to you every moment of every day, and that is okay. One way to read the Bible is to read a passage of Scripture until you bump up against something that makes you pause, and then stop there. Think about it. Maybe write down a few thoughts on why it's helpful, what God might be trying to tell you through it, and how you plan on living it out in your life. Context creates clarity, and clarity helps us understand what's really going on in Scripture, which can help us then understand why this may be helpful to us right now. As we discover what's helpful, we become people who are changed for the better. So, what if you and I made this decision to address the confusion in the Bible by pursuing the context in the Bible? Instead of us throwing up our hands and giving up because the Bible doesn't make sense, what if we approached it by asking some simple questions to help us explain the things that need explanation? If we did this, I bet the weirdness, the randomness, and the crazy things in the Bible would start to become things that we'd appreciate and could even impact our lives.